Are we men or mice? Are we going to slither away from this issue and hope for some epiphany to happen? No. Let's legislate. Let's vote.
That was Republican Trent Lott using colorful language and mixed metaphors to urge his fellow senators to take action on the immigration bill. And it's time now for our Sunday group. Britt Hume, Washington managing editor of Fox News, and Fox News contributors Mara Liasson of National Public Radio, Bill Kristol of the Weekly Standard, and Juan Williams also from National Public Radio. So, Britt, what happened to the immigration reform bill, and what are the chances that it will be revived?
Well, what happened to it was that the most powerful lobbying force of all came into play suddenly. It was a grassroots movement of opposition to this, and although there were powerful interests in both parties in support of it, they got overwhelmed for the moment. Now, they may yet be able to take this thing back from death's door and cobble something together and get it through the Senate. It would still face uncertainty in the House. So it's in very bad shape now. But really what happened was there was tremendous grassroots opposition to this bill.
Yeah, I think that although polls showed that the majority of Americans were actually for this, the people who cared the most about it were the people who didn't want it. I think that it shows that the center didn't hold in this case. This was a bipartisan compromise, and the people who were authors of this grand bargain tried to defend it from the attacks from the left and the right. The president didn't have enough clout to keep his own party on board, and for some reason the Democratic leadership didn't want to give it the next couple of days that the sponsors were begging for. I think that when Arlen Specter said this week the Democrats were wrong but the Republicans were wronger, or some version of that, he was probably right. I think that the biggest opposition came from the Republicans, but the Democrats' leadership seemed ambivalent about whether they actually wanted this.
Yeah, I want to ask you, Bill, we always say, let's not point fingers. Let's point some fingers here. I mean, you have one analysis, which is that the senators on the GOP side basically were going to amend this to death, and they couldn't get an agreement to limit the number of amendments. You also get an argument that this is the anti-Republican side, that the president really didn't push it hard enough or doesn't have the clout to push it. The flip side is that Harry Reid really didn't care much about the bill, let this Dorgan amendment on guest worker programs, poison pills, and that they refused, and this is demonstrated, that they refused Ted Kennedy's request to keep it up for a little bit longer. So where do you assess blame?
I'm happy to point fingers at everyone, but I would point fingers at the drafters of the bill. The more this bill was debated, the less able people were to defend it substantively. And I say this as someone who was sort of well-disposed in principle to this bill. Every time you read a serious exchange between a criticism of the bill and then a defense of it, the critics almost every time had the better of it. There was a panel here in Washington at the Hudson Institute. I wasn't at, but a very good friend of mine who knows a lot about this issue and went well-disposed to the bill. Two people on each side, serious substantive debate for 2 hours. He came back and said, very hard bill to defend. So I think Britt is right. There was a genuine democracy worked in two senses. There was a popular sort of uprising against it.
But uprising from the right or from the right and the left?
From both, though a little more from the right, obviously. It was the Republicans who ended up in the majority voting against cloture and opposing the bill. But that was not, I don't think, a nativist uprising, a xenophobic uprising would not have been enough. There were so many weaknesses in the way the bill was drafted. They cobbled it together, then they said, take it or leave it. And the idea that we're going to have a temporary worker program where people come for 2 years and are expected to leave for another year before they can come back for 2 more years, they're not going to leave. So you're just recreating the problem of illegal immigrants through this bill. That's just one of many instances where they didn't have a good substantive defense of the way they had drafted the bill.
Well, I happen to think that you have to make compromise. I think that's what politics is about. And there was a need, it seems to me, to acknowledge that the current system is illogical, it's inhumane, it's cruel, it's contrary to our ideals as Americans about giving people opportunity to do their best. What's really going on here? We're going back and forth in the minutia of Republicans taking key votes in order to defeat the bill and keep it from going forward. The reality is we're in a society that's undergoing a wave of immigration like we've never seen before. And I think there are lots of people who have psychological discomfort with the guys down at the 7-Eleven speaking Spanish, or Spanish as the language in the schools. And so that part of the electorate tends to be older, white, and conservative, and they're the talk show crowd, and they're the ones who have been hammering the Jim DeMints down in South Carolina without a contrary push coming from President Bush or coming from the business community.
I think there was a contrary push from President Bush. The problem is that at this stage of his presidency, given the profound unpopularity of the Iraq War, which is now the centerpiece of his presidency. He just doesn't have much influence anymore. He might have influence with individual members in some way at some critical moment, but all of his attempts to go out and influence the public sentiment in favor of this bill, I think, manifestly failed, and in one particular case made things much worse, and that was when he appeared to be taking shots at the people in his own coalition, conservatives in particular, who were against the bill.
Mara, I've heard a lot of people the last few days say this just shows that our government is broken, that when we have to deal with a big problem, Social Security reform, health care, in this case immigration, that we can't somehow put together a deal that will stand up. Do you see something fundamentally wrong with the system? And if so, why is it that we could pass civil rights legislation in the 60s, which was certainly is controversial, and we can't pass and deal with the big problems today?
It's not the system, it's the people who are in the system that can't seem to compromise. Look, if you're an American voter and you want Congress to get something done, and you voted for the Democrats because you thought that divided government would get more things done, you didn't like gridlock and paralysis, and you saw what happened this week, you'd have to conclude that it doesn't matter who's in charge, they just can't get together on a compromise. I think it's been really unfortunate. Now, maybe this bill can be resurrected. You know, the people who are for it seem to want to try again, but you're going to have a real commitment from the leadership of both parties in the Senate and the White House to get this done. And I don't see that happening.
Let's not forget how long it took to get civil rights legislation passed. I mean, that was an issue that was hanging over the United States Senate for decades before something finally happened.
Immigration has, too.
Well, it has. But on the other hand, they passed something some 20 years ago. It didn't work, and we're now dealing with the consequences of that. The issue has come to a head, really, in the last 2 or 3 years. For something to get dealt with in 2 or 3 years in this town, in this atmosphere, if it had happened, it would be warp speed.
Well, plus, I mean, there was a substantive argument that no bill was better than a bad bill, that the current immigration situation is not a crisis, it's a problem. The country's in pretty good shape. The illegal immigrants,
healthcare reform, Social Security reform. I mean, it seems like there's a pattern here that on the toughest issues, we can't get people to come together and legislate.
I don't know, some partisanship, but welfare reform. Look, healthcare reform was defeated in 93, 94, and that was a good thing for the country, too. I think to compare it with civil rights is obviously a little ridiculous. There, the moral equities were all on one side. I think this is a very controversial piece of legislation. The fact that it couldn't get jammed through in 2 weeks in the U.S. Senate proves nothing about the system. And, you know...
But wait a second, Bill. The kind of things that you think are badly written in this bill could be easily fixed. The fact that they have to go home for a year, that's a detail. The basic premise of the bill that you should do something about the 12 million who are here and do something about the border, that's something that there's consensus on. What the defenders of this bill, the grand bargainers, were asking for was more time to be able to make it to fix those problems.
That's just not the case. If they want to straighten the border, straighten the border. I'm in favor of a path to legalization for the 12 million who are here. The question is, why should you do that before you straighten the border and before you have lots more workers coming in who are going to be able to stay
But this it was a whole bill. It was a comprehensive reform package that included putting up more agents, putting up more security, more walls even, which I think is futile, but doing all those things, and yet you had this kind of lump of opposition that was not willing to play ball. I find that, you know, I think reflective of a deeper, intractable problem in the body politic of Washington at this moment.
All right, we need to